Thank you very much for being with us today. I have Pep van Haren from Wallbrook Advisory here to tell us about this firm and all of the great work he's been doing in the human rights and ESG advisory space. So, Pep, thanks for having come on today.
Yeah. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here. So like you mentioned, I'm a partner at Wallbrook. We're an ESG and diligence investigations firm. Originally, I am from the Netherlands, where I was born and raised. Did my bachelor's degree at Utrecht University in history and in political science at the University of Amsterdam. And then I moved to London to do a master's degree in international security studies at UCL. Spent a little bit of time in the Middle East working as an intern for the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, after which I moved to the US, worked for a boutique investigations firm, and joined basically a predecessor entity of Wallbrook in 2015. That's me in a nutshell, I guess.
So you're at the predecessor entity, then you're at Wallbrook, and now I understand that there's some news with you at Wallbrook.
We used to be part at a company called Strauss Friedberg, which was a cyber investigations company, actually, which was acquired by Aon, the insurance broker, in 2016. We were kind of the traditional investigations arm of Strauss. We didn't really function well under like a heavily regulated entity like Aon, where we were not core business. So we spun out after management buyout very amicably in 2018 as Wallbrook. Started with about 20-ish people and grown to 70 people with 7 offices. We're headquartered in London and have offices too here in the US, in Asia, in the Middle East, and in Europe. And traditionally, we were like an investigations firm. So we're not lawyers. We work with lawyers, usually as a force multiplier, as researchers, very often on behalf of private equity firms or investment firms, conducting pre-transactional due diligence for cross-border investments. So traditionally, it kind of comes from the FCPA, like anti-corruption and anti-bribery investigations, but it has grown much more to general reputational research. Like, is there anything the investment firm should know before they are acquiring this firm? While we were setting up that company, we pretty early on saw the need for ESG and rolled out kind of 4 main service offerings. And there's a lot of overlap between these, but they are kind of separate. So like, go over them real quick, but one is ESG advisory work, where we work with investment firms to help them at a firm level. So help them develop an ESG policy, help them with signing up for a PRI and other frameworks, deal with LPs, and who are very often a big driver of the ESG agenda, particularly in Europe from the big pension funds. So that's at the firm level. Then at the transaction level, we conduct ESG diligence, like what are the ESG risks related to a certain transaction. For instance, could be a workplace culture investigation into a software company. I can obviously give more details later on, but yeah, particular risks relating to a certain transaction. And then kind of the second bucket is our human rights work. So these can again be kind of subdivided in 2. So we have our human rights impact assessments or human rights due diligence, which is led by one of my colleagues, Mariana Abreu, who's a Brazilian human rights attorney. And there we help really corporates with assessing and improving the impact of their operations on their employees and on human rights. And there's where we really go on site, and interview employees and all the stakeholders. It's very different from like an audit, but again, I can provide more details later in the conversation. And then the second thing in the human rights space we do is supporting human rights lawsuits. So strategic research in, for instance, let's say a class action lawsuit filed on behalf of the local population against a multinational that caused an environmental disaster and that threatens people's livelihood. So yeah, growing that from about 20 to 70 people, work with the major private equity firms, private credit, corporates, but also a lot for foundations and university endowments. And I'm involved in kind of all of these work streams a little bit, some more than others. But yeah, as of yesterday, we made an important step in our journey, and we had a merger acquisition with Anthesis, which is a UK headquartered sustainability performance activator, so a sustainability consultancy. About 1,100 sustainability specialists in 22 countries. It's one of the fastest growing privately held firms in Europe, and definitely a little bit bigger than us. And kind of the investment thesis behind is that we have so many clients that are running into all of these issues, like environmental issues, social issues, governance issues, and very often these issues are they're interlinked. And so let me put my email so that doesn't pop up. But yeah, we have clients that run into all these issues, and having expertise at all of these levels means that we can serve our clients better. And partially those issues being linked is regulatory driven, particularly in Europe. We can chat about that more later as well. But yeah, that was the big news with Anthesis, and I'm also happy to elaborate more on what Anthesis does exactly and how it differs from us. But, yeah,
that was going to be my next question. I assume that there's complementary service offerings where there's some overlap, but not. But maybe you could tell me a bit more about what Anthesis does. Is it a more broad ESG advisory service?
So, well, there is very limited overlap in what we actually do. As in, we are very much focused on basically the S and the G with our human rights work and the anti-corruption and bribery work. They are very much focused on the environmental aspect. So they have a couple of service offerings, and I can run over them real quick. But one of them is sustainable production and consumption, where they are really looking at an actual physical product and how it can be more sustainable, looking at the life cycle, what goes in a product, how is it used, how is it being disposed, what kind of packaging do you use, the energy consumption, really working with R&D teams at corporates, and how to improve their products and make them more sustainable. And I guess even working basically on that level of what Patagonia has done a long time ago already, kind of the circular revenue, not only generating revenue streams from just selling more products, but see how you can basically generate revenues differently in a more circular way. Like Patagonia, you could return your coats, they will recycle them and make reuse every single polyester fiber. So that's one thing they do. Then they have a big climate group that really deals with the whole emissions. So it's both. They help you with your CDP, your carbon disclosure reports, target setting for major corporates. They do risk assessments for companies and the impact of climate change on their operations. GHG accounting, helping them. They have a digital platform called Route Zero, where companies can track their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, help companies to achieve net zero and science-based targets, increase their renewable energy use, water stewardship. So that's kind of the second leg. Then they have a supply chain arm that there's a tiny bit of overlap there, but kind of consists out of two different service offerings. One of them is really collect data and store it and help you analyze it. Again, kind of a web-based tool where companies can just collect all the data from the supply chains. And the other one is supplier engagement. So you can have all of these ambitions as a company, very hard ambitions, and we will help you actually engage, for instance, your suppliers to embed these ambitions as well. So that's really a training of suppliers and kind of a hand-holding exercise. And then the last is kind of a general strategy where they help companies like really achieve an ESG and sustainability strategy that is overlapping with their commercial strategy and help them like really link the two. So there is, for instance, also a part of that is their human rights work. So there's some overlap there, but there are those are things that we can work with them like really well, and it's really synergy and not any competing service offerings, which makes us like really a good fit.
Yeah, I often have conversations about that in the context of kind of supply chain matters, investigating and reporting on human rights issues in supply chains, and how there's a parallel to Scope 3 emissions reporting, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and how if you're going to be on the ground reporting on Scope 3 emissions, you might as well also investigate and have an understanding of the human rights implications of a given supplier.
And I mean, even in Europe with the corporate sustainability due diligence directive, which is like kind of part of that whole green taxonomy in Europe, like it links specifically the two, right? Like your impact on the environment, and human rights. So it's from a regulatory perspective, the two are more often linked now. So that's an interesting development.
Yeah. Sometimes you'll find people saying environmental issues are human rights issues, or vice versa, and you don't have to get into a turf war over it. We're all really interested in that's why I named my firm Impact Advocates, because we're really just thinking about how companies create impact, positive impact, negative impact.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. So I wanted to ask a bit more about your clients. It sounds like you're relatively agnostic, so you don't really cater to a specific regulatory approach, because the investigative work that you do could be applicable to companies regulated by FCPA or other AML laws, or UFLPA, the EU human rights due diligence approach. All of these different types of regulatory schemes require similar types of work that you seem to provide. Is that right? Or are there certain jurisdictions, industry groups, geographic areas?
With very wide client base, ranging from, like I mentioned, the private equity sector, private credit, but also do a lot of work in the hospitality industry, working a lot with hotel chains. We work a lot with, like I mentioned, universities, endowment funds. It's really wide. Like, I mean, we are B Corp, so is Anthesis. So we do not work with certain clients that we're just not comfortable with. But and that is nothing we can talk about later. But in general, we have clients in all kinds of like small, big, geographically, pretty much everywhere.
It sounds like so in the context of considering your supply chain from the perspective of UFLPA compliance, Uyghur Forced Labor Compliance, oftentimes, given the high threshold, high standard to actually rebut the presumption of forced labor, if you have connections to Uyghur labor, oftentimes companies are more concerned with mapping their supply chain to understand their exposure to Uyghur labor, to Xinjiang or listed entities. So that task is a bit different than it seems to be what your core skill set is. It seems like your core skill set is really deeply investigating a particular issue and spending a lot of time at a company and then digging down into that supply chain with really rigorous investigation, whereas mapping a supply chain is a bit of a different task, because it's more of a get a discrete set of information from a number of suppliers across your web of the supply chain. So it's a bit broader but less deep. That's how I try to differentiate it. Do you work in the UFLPA kind of mapping space as well, or are you more focused
so
on?
we work and we do work there as well. also because like it's very often, you have to dig really deep, and you have to go through a lot of a lot of different linked corporates that you want to go through. There's a lot of things. China has a pretty extensive public record compared to the rest of the world. Like in the US is really good regarding public records, but China's pretty, there's a lot of things that you can find out there. So we do, clients come to us with those questions as well. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned the Uyghur Act, because like I really see them in like kind of a new development of regulations similar, in Europe, like you mentioned, the CSDDD. You have in Germany the Lieferkettengesetz. You have the Norwegian Transparency Act, which is actually a very interesting one, because like there the public can ask companies what they're actually doing, and they are required to provide that information. And we think that's going to be very interesting. But what all of those regulations have in common, I think, is that it really switches the burden of proof to the company, where a company has to like prove like, look, we've done the research and it's okay. And it's very different from where it used to be like all about transparency, which clearly has not worked. And I think what is also very interesting about all of these is that they are similar to like GDPR and FCPA, that they're very much extraterritorial. So like it might be an EU regulation, but looking at the numbers and who falls within those thresholds, it's a lot. And even when even in Norway, like it's really low numbers actually. So if you are a US company and you have you touch the Norwegian market, like you're going to get impacted by these regulations. And
yeah, there are a couple of different ways. In one way, it's if you're targeting that market, that consumer market, and you want to play in that consumer market, then you're going to be subject to a lot of those supply chain laws. But also, if you're just a supplier to an entity, that might be regulated. So if you say I'm in Malaysia, or I'm in wherever you can think of Malaysia, the US, if you're supplying to a supplier that's subject to the German due diligence law, you're going to be giving them reporting figures because they need those.
No, and a lot of these regulatory frameworks are still being developed, right? Like the European Parliament just voted on the Corporate Sustainability Directive. It takes another, I think it's 2 or 3 years that member states have time to like actually implement them. And it's going to be highly dependent on which country, how they do it. So it's really going to be a while. But I think the German one, there are some interesting developments right there now, because like the German Supply Chain Act, they recently had the first complaint was filed. And it's really going to be kind of a test case about what's going to happen. Like it was the Bangladeshi, it's a trade union for the garment sector, and it's going to be very interesting to see what BAFA, which is the organization that oversees the act, what they're going to do with it. Like, are they going to take like kind of a check the box approach? Like, okay, because it's filed against, I believe, Amazon, IKEA, and Tom Taylor, if I'm correct. It's going to be like, what are they going to do? Are they actually going to be investigating, or kind of, take that best efforts approach where it's going to be like check the box exercise, and where they will be satisfied pretty quickly? There are some indications that they're actually going to do a good job, because BAFA already reached out to about 70 or 80 companies earlier this year to like literally just retrieve information from them, like what are you doing to comply, which I think will be is somehow of an indication that they're not just gonna do nothing. But like that's going to be the question with all of these pieces of legislation, right? Like what are how are they actually going to enforce it? Who are they going to enforce it against? And it's going to be an interesting couple of years.
Yeah, and the best that we can do is just give everyone the information that we have as experts, legal experts, as investigative experts. You can give them the situation. Do you have lawyers on staff that speak to kind of the regulatory landscape, or do you often liaise with
So
other lawyers.
yes, but we're not like we have some lawyers working, but like none of them are practicing. Like we work very much hand in hand with lawyers, with general counsels, with compliance lawyers, with outside counsel very often, because we do not provide you with legal advice. We're
Yeah.
like the executing arm. We are helping you with the research, with retrieving the facts, with interpreting, with improving your the outcome of it. But we're not lawyers. That's not what we do.
What one random question I had, and it might just mainly be interesting to me, but in the context of your work doing litigation support for human rights issues, do you ever provide expert evidence on a particular topic, or is it mainly just investigating the issues?
No, but we'll help you with identifying experts.
Yeah.
So, because obviously we cannot be everywhere. It's not that we,
Yeah.
When a dam collapses in whatever South America, like, chances of one of us actually being an expert in that are very low. But we'll help you with identifying witnesses, people that can testify. Yeah.
Okay. So, you gave me such a really helpful kind of summary of the various use cases that your firm can be of help in. Maybe we could discuss a particular problem. I often like to ask, what are some problems that you're helping companies deal with? And I think in your case, you'd probably say better visibility, deeper visibility in company supply chains, in companies' commerce. But maybe you could tell me a bit more about
Yeah.
what are some
I
of the
mean,
key problems you're dealing with.
I think it's really like the human rights piece, the human rights diligence, human rights impact assessments. It's not really on a lot of our clients' radar yet. They're not really thinking about it, but they should get at least prepared. They should
Yeah.
at least start to think about it and what they need to do, because it's going to show up, and there's going to be, if this actually plays out the way it might play out, there's going to be a lot of work to do, and you kind of you just need to be prepared. I mean, there's a lot of problems that we see in the market and in the kind of the unintended effects as well, right? Of what we all do. Like, a good example is like earlier in the 2000s, there were a lot of reports about issues at clothing factories in Cambodia. Like there was a BBC documentary about underage workers, sweatshop conditions. As a result of that, all these major firms pulled out of the market, like Nike, Gap, just left, and that had a terrible effect on the actual workers. Like it had an opposite effect. There was a huge amount of women that were pushed into prostitution. That is like there's a huge effect, and that's what we need to avoid. Like companies cannot just cut the ties and identify a problematic issue in their operations and just stop engaging with it. They need to engage. They need to improve the conditions and bad practices. And we should avoid a repetition of this Cambodian sweatshop story. And you could even pull out wider, not only human rights impact, human rights issues, but also the larger kind of ESG investment sector. Like a lot of ESG investors sometimes are a little afraid of emerging markets, afraid that they will run into issues that doesn't fit their metrics and pull capital. Like they screen out investments because a company doesn't they fail to meet their benchmarks, and pull capital from emerging markets. But if we want to meet the UN sustainability goals, which is 3 or 4 trillion US dollars for developing countries, we need that private capital to be invested, and not just screen them out. There needs to be actual engagement, and to help improve the conditions, which is something we can help with. And I think one of these things is what people need to understand also is very much a difference between human rights impact assessments and kind of traditional auditing and how big that difference is.
Tell me a bit more about the difference between a human rights impact assessment and a traditional audit.
Yeah, of course. So like audits have, there have been several instances of companies that, were audited
Yes, of
very recently.
course.
Bangladesh, the Rana Plaza
Yeah,
hire was a good example. You had Top Glove,
yeah,
both passed their audits, but had obviously huge issues. And I think audits are very often a way for a company to police their
yeah.
immediate suppliers. It's very often only the first tier. It doesn't go really further down the supply chain. It's at best a way to identify some symptoms, but not like actually identify root causes of what's going wrong. And the goal is really to it's really to identify issues for the company and not like the impact on its employees, people, the planet. It's really very different. Like human rights due diligence, human rights impact assessments are like risk-based approaches. It's like it goes much further down the supply chain. You're looking at what the risks are and the impacts are of your operations on all your stakeholders, not only the company itself, its employees, its contractors, it's the further environment. It's much more proactive to address those systemic issues. And I hate this word, but it's part of a human rights risk management strategy. Like it's like terrible jargon. It's horrible, but like you need to be like mapping those risks, and you need to go on site and talk to people and interview employees. You need to like you also really need to think about like how you're going to interview these people, what kind of setting, what kind of grievance mechanisms are there, and even when you're as part of a human rights impact assessment, you're not able to identify every single issue, right? But at least you will be able to like identify those blind spots and know what you don't know, and like really do like thorough research. But yeah, it takes
To give you kind of
into
a law school term, we say it's a necessary but not sufficient tool. Audits are incredibly necessary, but they're not sufficient sometimes, and particularly in years past, companies, particularly before the kind of human rights due diligence regulatory regime came online, companies tried to satisfy themselves with saying, well, we have a supplier code of conduct, which is basically a set of unilateral terms, representations, and warranties that were never enforced.
yeah.
And then we perform audits regularly. But the thing is, an audit is a useful snapshot in time. It's useful to gather data, but it's really much better at monitoring the progress of companies that are already compliant and already
Yeah.
generally within your frame of how you want to do business, generally within the nature of how you work. So you have to do the human rights impact assessment, the risk analysis, to get a fully qualitative understanding of your counterparties. But then the audits are helpful to monitor the progress, take snapshots along the way.
Yeah.
Do you use audits as a tool, for instance, for that
Well,
purpose?
it's useful data.
Yeah.
That we can use, but like there's often often wrong incentives, like the department or the office or the what do you call it, like the manufacturing site being audited is paying the auditor. Like human rights impact assessments, very like we usually engage through general counsel, like higher level, like not the local level, so we can actually, there's no conflict of interest there. And I think a good example of this is the Bangladeshi example, where to know what's going on there, like you need to take into consideration like the sector risks in the garment sector in Bangladesh, right? They use highly flammable materials. You need to use the local political country risk environment where very overcrowded manufacturing sites are very often, like, they're very common. So you need to take that into consideration. It cannot just be like a health and safety audit. That's not sufficient.
Mhm. And I wanted to maybe circle back a bit to your point about kind of what you can term responsible exits, not just saying that we're going to just extricate our entire business line from this area of the world or the sector. Is your firm ever involved in remediative efforts? So when you discover human rights issues within supply chains, do you have staff that manage remediation plans and implementation of remediation plans, perhaps conflict
No, absolutely. I mean,
resolution?
just identifying the issue is not enough, right? Like, there
Exactly.
needs to be it needs to be addressed, and we help with that. It's very dependent on the client and kind of the resources that they have in place themselves, like how much help they need that with that, or if that's something that we can help them with. So that's very dependent on the situation, but yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Like, that's our our reports are all over, like, what do you need to do? Not only like what did you identify, like what did we identify and what's wrong, like what you actually need to do, what you don't know yet, how you can improve it, and how and what kind of timelines and what's feasible and what's not. Because you can also, like, you cannot address everything, right? Like, there are some things that are out of your control. So you need to, like, look at, like, what is the most, what's most severe, what's has the most impact, and what can you do about it.
Yeah, I assume this is the case, but considering your involvement in litigation support, do you also give an assessment in your overall human rights impact assessment? Do you give an assessment of litigation risk for specific topics?
For a specific conflict set.
Specific topics. Apologies,
Oh,
my phone went off. That's
oh, no worries. Uh, yeah, I mean, as part of our research, we do extensive public records research as well. So, like, when we are looking at manufacturing side in a certain country, like, we need to, like, we do extensive public records research to see, has the company been sued or is currently subject to certain litigation by employees that have filed I don't know, sexual harassment lawsuits, or unpaid overtime or whatever. Like, yeah, we conduct that research because that's, it's an important data point for us to, like, know what the actual situation is.
Hmm. Um, and then I guess you would liaise with in-house counsel. I guess the question I was getting at is a bit more nuanced, but if you think about it in the context of, say, the UK regulatory or litigation regime, there's the duty of care where parent and subsidiary have different responsibilities based on the UK jurisprudence. But then that jurisprudence is different in the US context. We have a lot more of these consumer protection statutes, and we have the Alien Tort Statute, which is obviously not very effective anymore as far as extraterritorial torts. But I guess your point that you probably mentioned earlier was that you liaise with uh, in-house counsel or outside counsel that are doing that kind of
Yeah,
litigation risk analysis. You're providing the data so that they
yeah,
can make that legal.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, that's one of the points that we really work hand in hand with the attorneys.
Yeah, I'm trying to circle it back to the lawyers because many of the people listening here, or the 12 or 13 people who are listening, are probably mainly lawyers. So we'd
Yeah,
want
no,
to make sure.
absolutely. And it's like, it's an interesting, it's always important for us to, like, kind of, in the US and in the UK, for instance, attorneys are very much familiar with investigators that help with, cross-border due diligence. They're
In the
aware
FCPA context, right?
that they're very much aware of it and see the benefit of it, and know they are, like, hugely helpful, and honestly you can't really do without them. It's funny because in a lot of, like, continental Europe, very much not familiar with it, don't see the benefit of it, think that, and there are a couple of reasons for it, I think, but yeah, but it's to make my point, it's important for us to know that, for attorneys to know that we work hand in hand with you. We're not giving legal advice. We often, like there's very much a synergy where we work with you, and at the end of the day, like often create more work for the attorneys as well.
Yeah, well, yeah, because then you identify issues that we have to analyze and assess and provide
Yeah,
solutions for in that context.
I mean
That's
it's
really
similar to,
interesting. So European clients are more used to contracting European counsel to undertake the legal analysis and the investigative work.
yeah, I think I'm not like 100%
Yeah.
sure why. We have clients in Europe, and I'm strictly talking about the traditional investigations work, not about like the human rights work, because that obviously is, there's a lot of work there in Europe, given the kind of the more advanced regulatory framework there than here in the US. But
That was my thought, is that there's
yeah,
so much more work, there's so much more
yeah.
investigating being
No,
undertaken.
on that topic, we work with them a lot, but like I'm talking about the traditional kind of FCPA
Yes.
reputational diligence. There, it's not very often, only in very specific cases we will work with them, rather than in the U.S. any major private equity firm will use a firm like ours to work hand in hand with the lawyers. Like there's no exception there.
Yeah, I remember when I was a young lawyer, I was involved in a case where there was a company was purchased, and then shortly thereafter, the purchasing company discovered FCPA issues and promptly informed the DOJ. And then we were representing a creditor of the purchased company, and
Mm.
the company was liquidated like shortly after it was purchased. And we were just trying to wrap our heads around how this company was purchased, not knowing that there was this bomb about to go off within this company, this FCPA bomb. But it's because
Yeah,
they didn't hire a company like yours to do the due diligence beforehand. They did it
yeah,
after the fact.
yeah. No, and that's you know, obviously a lot of investigations we're involved in are super vanilla and are, nothing's wrong, the vast majority of them. But there is that remaining percentage that it is a time bomb. And the issue is, not the issue is the solution. Like it's very rare that a deal collapses because of an actual issue, right? Like that's where the lawyers come in and actually help, to separate the issue and to mitigate it and to isolate it.
Yeah,
And
quarantine the issue. Yeah.
exactly like a deal collapsing because of something that we identify. It happens, but it's very rare.
Yeah, yeah. It more just gives the parties full understanding of what it is that they're
Yeah,
purchasing
yeah. And what
and
you need,
warts and
and
all.
honestly, like for an acquiring party, it's often it's leverage as well, right? Like if when you do your research, you identify an issue in XYZ, you go to the selling parties like, hey, this is all all good, but like we identified this, like this is an issue, we need to resolve this, we need to engage lawyers to fix this, like and that's how you negotiate a better price.
Yeah, not to simplify it too much, but the same way you find you when you purchase a home, you have someone come in and inspect the home to make sure that there aren't any issues. Oftentimes they might find a roof that needs to be redone. That doesn't mean you don't purchase
Yeah,
the house. It just means you might renegotiate some. Yeah,
exactly.
just to simplify it for some of them.
Yeah.
And another point I wanted to so that's been a really interesting conversation. It really gives us a great sense of the work you do and how you liaise with lawyers in a lot of different contexts. Did you study law in Europe?
I did not. No, no.
Lucky for you,
Um,
friend.
no, it's interesting. A lot of our investigators, there's a couple, they come from all walks of life, but like it's a lot of people that have a background in like international relations and international politics, because like you need to know about, when you're investigating a potential acquisition target, or you're doing human rights diligence in Malaysia, like you need to know about the local context. Like you cannot just like walk in and think, being a human rights expert is not enough. Like you need to know the local context. So a lot of them come from that. kind of background.
Like development, like they spent their 20s at development organizations, so they were on the ground
Yeah,
in those developing countries.
journalists, a bunch of journalists, you know, very often from the NGO sector, from the you know, foundation sector. Like it's a very diverse crowd.
That's really
But
great.
I guess the common denominator is that they are all you know, naturally curious people. That's how we recruit people. Like you need to, like, you know, we can teach you how to you know, search public records and how to you know, how to write a good report, but like to be naturally curious, to actually wanting to identify everything that could be wrong. That's something that's very hard to teach.
There's like an instinct to see a thread and want to pull on it, and some people just
Exactly.
don't have the instinct to want to pull on the thread. They
Yeah.
just want to move on. But
You need to be willing to like dig through a bunch of extremely boring documents and you know, the chance that there might be something there that is very relevant.
I mean, it's similar in the context of complex commercial disputes where I've spent a lot of time, I've spent many nights looking through email chains, looking for something. And
Yeah.
it's always so, you feel relieved when you find something because you feel like you've rationalized the last few
Yeah.
hours you spent.
Yeah.
But then the other side isn't relieved, or whoever your client is isn't always relieved when you find something. Maybe I'd expect, given your kind of leadership role in this space, does Wallbrook put out regular white papers, research papers? Is there any further reading that you might direct us to?
Whenever we have time, we publish something.
Hmm.
It's always hard. It's funny because obviously we it's something all of our you know, researchers enjoy doing, to like kind of write about what they are working on and like kind of, you know, putting that out. So we do publish very regularly on our website about, you know, developments that we see in a certain jurisdiction, about political developments. So yeah, we publish, you know, we publish regularly on our website, but it's not really a, you know, it's not really a thing that, you know, every Friday there's a new article. You know, it's about twice a month, something like that. But when we're swamped, it's not happening. And then, you know, someone writes an article and it's on the back burner for like a month, and it's like, oh yeah, wait, let me actually have a spare hour. Let me work on this, and then, you know, it goes online. But yeah, we do try to.
And I mean, obviously, the work that you do is incredibly confidential. So there's only so much you could
Yeah.
do. You can't
So
really use a
obviously,
case analysis and
yeah,
publish that.
that is, you're absolutely right about that. It's very rare that we can actually speak about our clients. Yeah.
Yeah, and when you're liaising with counsel, that allows for the work that you're doing to be legally privileged in most contexts, right
Yep.
out of it. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Just one final question, just to ask, if you have any thoughts on where you see the future in this space going with respect to kind of ESG laws, or how the industry might approach ESG issues in the future.
I mean, it's a very tricky one, I think. It's like, um, it's so hard. I mean, it's a cliche, but it's so hard to predict the future.
I'd say the
And
genie's out of the bottle, though, for the types of work that you and I do. Although we don't know exactly what shape it's going to take, we don't know exactly
yeah,
what shape the regulation will be and what constraints companies will have. We know that these are issues that they must consider, right?
yes. So we describe it as the Brussels bandwagon. You know, there's a lot of regulation coming out of Brussels. There's a lot of jurisdiction that are aligning basically their national policies to the EU green taxonomy. Like you see it in Latin America, a lot of countries like Chile, like Argentina, Australia is looking at it. So there's a lot of countries that are like kind of bandwagoning with Europe, you know, because it's such a big market. And, you know, when you're active there as a major firm, like, you know, you need to comply. It's not going to be not possible. I mean, I think one of the things that's going to be tricky is obviously the US in the next kind of presidential election and what's going to happen. It has become so incredibly political in the US, the whole ESG and sustainability agenda. Like sometimes I think like the kind of the whole debate needs to be like reframed for a part of the kind of, primarily Republican Party, but like, yeah, China is taking already a leadership role in this. China is investing in sustainable energy, as a leader in, obviously polysilicon, solar panels. In the automotive industry, Tesla's biggest competitors are from China. So, do you want, and oil will run out. Like, we know that, whether or not it will eventually run out. Like, do you want, so we'll need a different energy supply. So do you want to give China like a 20, 30-year competitive advantage versus the US? I think sometimes when we like just reframe some of these issues that we're talking about for a certain public that does not agree with the sustainability agenda, it's like, even if you deny climate change, even if you, hate the whole concept, like oil will run out, you'll need a different energy source. So yeah, but I have a hard time believing that that's actually going to happen, that we can,
Well, one, helpful confluence, in a polarized society in the context of human rights issues, the Uyghur issue. There's a lot of people, maybe we can put them on the right, who have more protectionist leanings, who want to see the U.S. Closer to friendshoring, nearshoring, all of those things. And then you have people on the left who might be motivated by human rights concerns, but when they combine their efforts, and you see greater enforcement of WROs, you see the UFLPA, and you see further human rights legislation and regulatory efforts down the pike, because we can get the alchemy of different motivations coalescing around one helpful goal.
Yeah, but it's tricky. It's hard.
And then one final just point to make. We talked about doing this a couple of months ago, but we postponed because you welcomed your firstborn baby boy. How is everything?
8 weeks old today. We had an incredible night because he slept from 9 till 5, which was kind of unheard of, which is great. That's why I don't look exhausted right now.
You look great.
So,
you look,
He's been amazing. He's been honestly, we're very fortunate because he eats well, sleeps well. So I keep saying I'm sure he's going to be a terrible, terrible teenager and get back with us. But yeah, no, it's been great. Thank you. You literally,
my firstborn was son. I went back to the office and said, "You won't believe it. I have the cutest baby in the entire world."
Yeah. I received your message while we were on our way to the hospital. So yeah. Because we were scheduled to be, my wife was scheduled to be induced, and it was literally like we're just, there's a lot of downtime there as well, waiting for it. And I was like, hey, that's interesting. But yeah,
but definitely not tomorrow. Well,
that was April 11th, if I recall correctly.
Well, thank you for taking an hour out of this wonderful time in your life to come and talk about these really important issues. I really appreciate you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. This was great.